Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this session, which is looking at how to build resilience in electricity infrastructure. My name is Rosemary Lister, and I'm the Professor of Climate and Environmental Law at Sydney Law School. And so I'll be hosting and presenting first, and then my colleague, Associate Professor Gregor Verbich, will present after me, and then my colleague, Dr. Anne Callies from RMIT in Melbourne, and she's going to be presenting online.
Okay, so my name is Gregor Verbich. I'm actually being promoted this year. So now professor in the School of Electrical Engineering. Thank you. Sorry, couldn't resist. And I'm also director of the Center for Future Energy Network. So as Rosemary said, I was part of ARC DP Discovery Project led by her. And my area of expertise is grid and market integration of distributed energy resources and also large-scale renewables. So my particular interest in this project was to how to use the emerging technologies to make the grid more resilient by redesigning the network structure. So the focus of my talk today is to present my view of how the electric power system might evolve into the future, so that not only we end up with a greener power supply, but also a more resilient power grid. So I'm going to talk about local supply options and discuss how that can increase the resilience of the electricity infrastructure. So I guess most of you know what I'm showing this. So essentially what I'm trying to say is that we've got this emerging, okay, so I'm showing this slide just to get across the message that we've got this increasing penetration of variable renewables, not only large scale, which would be green in this slide. So that's South Australia in one spring day last year, but also rooftop solar. So this yellow bit here is rooftop solar generation, which occasionally covers most of the month in South Australia. So I guess most of you know that South Australia is part of the national electricity market, or the interconnection on the eastern seaboard, and is actually here at the end of the grid. So that goes to show, and if we look at the projection of, the anticipated growth of behind the meter distributed energy resources, both batteries and rooftop solar, we see that in the future most of the electricity supply will be decentralized. So this prediction is from Bloomberg back from 2017, and back then Energy Networks Australia, in their Open Energy Networks discussion paper, adopted that figure, so it may be a bit bullish. So AEMO's figure is probably slightly lower than that. But just for the sake of the argument, so they predicted that by 2040, 45% of generation will come from behind the meter energy resources. So what it means for the power grid, and here I'm using a slightly simplified diagram on the right to help my message across. So here we have the transmission is red, then in the middle it's distribution, so medium voltage distribution, low voltage distribution. So I simplified that by putting everything here in the middle, so even though that's a meshed grid. But what I'm trying to show is that in the olden days, so it's still to a large extent today, the electricity flow is from a relatively low number of central generation plants down to the loads located at low voltage distribution networks. But now when people increasingly adopt distributed generation and storage, now the electric power flow becomes bidirectional, to the extent that behind the meter distributed energy resources can even supply the loads in other parts of the grid, which was the case in in South Australian example I showed before. So what it means is now that given that we have so much capacity behind the meter, that offers an opportunity to decentralize power supply, to supply power locally with what is generated, which can both reduce the cost and also help increase the resilience of the grid, as I will discuss now. So essentially, what the options are, the conventional grid supply system is, well, the baseline, so this is what we have today, or so what was the case in the past. But now when we move towards more distributed energy supply, so we've got an option of using either embedded networks, microgrids, energy hubs, or virtual power plants. So I'll go through those options in a minute. And the benefits of local energy supply, as I said before, is not only we generate power locally, so we can reduce the cost of transmission, but also we make the system less prone to cascading outages. So as Rosemary said in her presentation, the vast majority of the outages are due to the outages in the transmission network or distribution network. So when we lose transmission lines, then the end customers end up in the dark. Even though today many people have rooftop solar, but those rooftop solar systems are not equipped with the technology to supply power locally when the bulk system is lost. So to go through those local supply options, so first of all, we have embedded networks, which is essentially a private electricity network that serve multiple premises, either apartment blocks or shopping center. They have their own operator, which can be a retailer, and the objective is autonomy and cost minimization. A microgrid is a similar concept, but the key distinction is that the microgrids can also operate in an isolated mode. So they can disconnect from the main grid and still continue supply local loads. But that requires specialized equipment, and in particular they require a so-called grid-forming energy source. As I mentioned before, rooftop solar systems are not grid-forming, they are grid-following, which means that they require a connection to the main grid to synchronize with the grid and to be able to supply power. So the objective of a microgrid might also be to improve reliability of power supply, and this is increasingly the option they use. The Horizon Power in WA uses or is moving towards to supply local communities that are located far away from the main grid, typically connected by unreliable connections. So when this connection is lost, they have the option to supply power locally. Now, an energy hubs is a related concept, and the key distinction is that we don't focus only electricity, but we also look at different energy vectors. So, for example, we can take into account hydrogen, gas, and electricity, and see how we can co-optimize those energy vectors again to reduce the operational costs and reduce emissions. And we also have an option to design energy hubs to be able to operate in an isolated mode. Now, a virtual power plant, that is a slightly different concept. It's basically aggregation of resources across the network, so not necessarily suitable for isolated power supply. So now just to sorry, this got messed up a little bit. Those concepts, the definitions that you will get across in the literature are not totally consistent. So this is from ARENA, where they call microgrids. So they basically split microgrids into different kinds. So the first one is embedded microgrid, which would be basically an embedded network according to my presentation. And then they have standalone power systems, which is a grid-connected microgrid with an ability to disconnect from the main grid, but most of the time is connected to the main grid. And then we have remote isolated microgrid that always operate isolated from the main grid. They typically supply local communities. So to increase the resiliency of the electricity infrastructure. So we have this option of hardening, which can mean either augmenting the transmission infrastructure or make the networks more meshed. So for example, distribution networks in Sydney CBD is highly meshed, even though otherwise distribution networks are radial. So that's an expensive option. The next option is greening, which is using renewable energy sources, which increases the security of energy supplies because we have this option of supplying the power locally and don't rely on the power grid. And finally is the smartening, which is using smart energy management and grid forming technology to equip fringes of the grid with the ability to operate in an isolated mode when the transmission infrastructure is lost. So maybe a few case studies. So this is already happening. So one is Yakananda Community Microgrid in Victoria. So the motivation here is to equip the community with the technologies to enable that community to be supplied also when the grid connection is lost. And this is because the community is supplied by an unreliable single wire earth return grid connection. So they have a combination of grid forming batteries and rooftop solar systems, and they also have these smart energy controllers that allow sharing energy across the community. Now, a little bit of self-promotion. So this is the work we are doing with a company, Velocet Clean Energy. So they're in the business of developing microgrids for clubs in regional Australia. So they have currently 2 clubs on the border between New South Wales and Victoria operational. So the idea here, so the primary objective was to reduce the cost of energy supply for those clubs. So they're typically in a megawatt range. And also to address the question of reliability, because those clubs are connected at the fringe of grid, so oftentimes they lose connection, and the owners of those clubs don't like that. And I have to say that it's because of the pokey machines, so not very popular, socially acceptable, I don't know how to put it. Anyway, I won't go into that. So we use again, a combination of PV and batteries and also diesel for backup supply. So VC engaged us to develop energy management technologies for those clubs because they figure out that they can only do that much by operating batteries to maximize PV self-consumption, but we developed optimization algorithms so that those clubs can also trade energy in the wholesale market, which is now very profitable because prices oftentimes go negative. So now we are extending this model to turn those clubs into proper microgrids that can also disconnect from the main grid, but also provide network support to the distribution grids, in particular system strength and inertia and voltage support, and this is made possible by using grid forming technology. So we are now extending their collaboration, building a proper 3-phase microgrid. So here it's still a single-phase microgrid. So we have a real-time digital simulator, a PV emulator, a battery, inverter, and an RTDS, so real-time digital simulator that simulates the behavior of the grid. So essentially we have a laboratory prototype model of a local microgrid, so which will make it possible to test in a laboratory environment all those strategies that I mentioned before. And yeah, so this final slide. So also we did a bit of research, and we showed that provided that each inverter, each PV inverter or PV battery inverter is grid forming, then you can disconnect low voltage feeders from the rest of the network and operate them as microgrids. So essentially what we wanted to show is that this decentralized power supply is possible. So when you lose the connection to the main grid, you can basically take whole distribution feeders off the grid and keep operating them as microgrids. And the main advantage of that approach is that it doesn't really require a lot of additional infrastructure, because to turn a grid following inverter into a grid forming one doesn't require new hardware, just requires new control, which is the marginal cost of doing that is really small. So the main motivation for this work is to show what is possible to hopefully inform the policy and regulatory debate to hopefully sometime in the future make or require all the new generation of PV inverters, PV and battery inverters to be grid forming, so which opens up many new opportunities for decentralized power supply. So that's all I had to say. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks very much, Gregor, and I think you can see the synergies between our work, because the lawyers have always been chasing after the engineers, trying to understand what the engineers do, and then develop a system to control whatever else is going on. So thank you very much. And it's my pleasure now to ask Dr. Anne Callies from RMIT in Melbourne to present. Is Anne, oh, there's Anne. Okay, hi Anne.
Come through fine.
Yes, we
I will share my screen. Okay. So now, hopefully this is working. Just move the chat somewhere else so I can see what I'm doing. Okay, thank you so much for making this space for me, dialing in from Victoria. I'm acknowledging that I'm right now sitting here on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Eastern Kulin Nation here in Melbourne. And I'm basically almost launching off what Rosemary has talked about before, because one of the questions we ended up asking is, should it be the planning frameworks we need to, that have most potential to help build resilience for the future grid? Now, planning law is state law at the moment, and you've heard, Rosemary, about the fact that this is actually a problem, because it means we have this kind of piecemeal picture of planning law approaches across Australia. So I'm introducing one case study, and that is Victoria. I'm trying to move my So I'll do a little bit of setting up on what's happening right now in Victoria, to illustrate the scale of the challenge we have. But then I'm doing a bit of a deep dive into land use planning law, and what it has to tell us about resilience. And you already heard some first lessons from Rosemary, and I'm going to, reiterate a little bit on that, and, my lessons from Victoria so far. It's very exciting. As Rosemary said before, this is a project where actually comparing also Queensland planning laws and New South Wales planning laws. It's not my area of expertise, so I'll be speaking specifically on Victoria, but it has been fascinating to see how different it actually is. And that in itself is really a lesson. Victoria is accelerating its transition massively with the Labour government after the last state election, really, reconfirming and stepping up commitments. What is interesting is Victoria has a Climate Change Act, the Climate Change Act 2017, which includes an overall policy objective to build the resilience of the state's infrastructure through effective adaptation and disaster preparedness action. So we actually have this kind of high-level objective, and the Climate Change Act objectives are objectives on the government, on the different ministries. So I'll talk about how we start seeing these types of commitments trickling through. We have just tightened renewable energy targets in Victoria again. So we have legislated targets in the Climate Change Act, but we also have election announcements. And, I've just checked, hasn't come through in the legislative pipeline yet, but Labour has committed to 65% renewables by 2030 and 95% by 2035. And we also have 6.3 gigawatts storage by 2035 and 2 gigawatt of offshore wind generation by 2030, not 2032 for this one, I think. And so this is happening, and what we will see, presumably, is a massive infrastructure investment boom. So now is the time to really think about, is what we are doing climate resilient, and at which stage in this process of building do we assess resilience and how? These are Victoria's renewable energy zones. You've seen a picture earlier of the New South Wales ones. So in February 2021, the Victorian government released the Victorian Renewable Energy Zones Development Plans Direction Paper, long title, which established these 6 RES. Now, has resilience gone into assessing where these are going? Not really. I had a look at the criteria. You can look that up. There was a scorecard assessment in IEMO's Integrated System Plan 2018, from which this flowed on. They looked at availability of renewable resources, quality of the renewable resources, network limitations, and long-term market simulations. So I actually searched that document. Resilience didn't really feature there. So we now are seeing specific, in particular, network investment approved, which will be actually needed to grow these renewable energy zones, to make them happen, if you like. The biggest committed network project at the moment is Sydenham to Bulgana. This is this green line, kind of from Melbourne in the middle, going left into the Western Victorian line. That is 190 kilometers of new overhead transmission line, various terminal stations to be built and updated, and so on. So, but that's just the beginning, if you like. If we really want to make this happen, and if we really want to achieve the targets. Enough setting up. Where does planning law come into the picture? I think one really important thing to remember is this is really not just about planning law. Planning law is one of many assessment regimes through which any piece of infrastructure, like a big transmission line, has to go. We have electricity market regulations. We have the federal EPBC Act, that is basically your environmental impact assessment. Then there are state environmental impact assessment regimes. There is heritage and native vegetation protections, emergency management, and critical infrastructure assessments, and then there's planning law. And we shouldn't forget this. So it's basically, it's not going to be that one bullet. There's more a question of how can we usefully and seamlessly integrate assessments done on all of these levels. So, Planning and Environment Act Victoria, the PA, is the #1 or the big land use planning act in Victoria, and it tells you a little bit about that tail end of planning law. And I'm saying tail, and I'm going to come back a little bit to this. When are we actually looking at planning law? What do planners actually have to look at and to assess when they get a planning application, actually for anything, not just for a big or a piece of big infrastructure like electricity infrastructure usually is. So they are looking at the objectives of planning, the relevant planning scheme, any applicable policy, strategy, code, or guideline. And I've marked this up a bit because it's quite interesting, and it's something that we haven't found for the other states. Any significant effects which the development may have on the environment, or which the environment may have on the use or development. And I'm saying this is really interesting because it could be an opportunity to consider the future environment in which we build this piece of infrastructure. and the impact of climate change in the future on this piece of infrastructure, which brings us back into, is that a spot where we can consider resilience? So let's go through one by one. I also should say for that last section, and all of these are from section 60 of the Planning and Environment Act, if someone wants to have a look at that. This kind of the impact the environment may have on the use or development. That sounds great, but I haven't been able to find any case law or any planning panels that have actually used this phrase or looked at the significant effects the environment has on the use or development. So it's there. It could be enlivened, but it hasn't so far. But let's go through the other things that a planner will look at when assessing. The objectives of the planning system, there are more than those. There is a long list. You will see I've extracted A, B, and E because they are closest to what we are talking about here. One is the sustainable use and development of land. One is the protection of natural and man-made resources, and E is to protect public utilities for the benefit of the community. We are not seeing the word resilience here, but we are seeing some words that would allow us to make a resilience assessment. All of this, though, is, again, something that Rosemary already said. This is when you have a very specific project and it comes all the way through the pipeline at the end to a planning assessment. So it doesn't really allow you this kind of step out and say, should we be building here at all? It is asking, should we build this thing here? It's not asking, maybe it's better to go decentralized, like we've just heard in Gregor's presentation. So it's really, it's a case-by-case assessment. This is where planning law comes in. We also have the relevant planning scheme. As we said earlier, that's one of the things that planners have to take into account when they make a planning assessment. Now, this is where a lot of action has been happening, undoubtedly driven by that new objective in the Climate Change Act to, enhance resilience in infrastructure. By way of background, planning schemes in Victoria, unlike in other states, have a large amount of preset content. So that is content, it's so-called the Victorian planning provisions, the VPP, I have them already abbreviated up there on the slide. They are identical for all planning schemes across the state. And in 2022, we had a number of changes to the VPP, which have really started to introduce resilience ideas into specific clauses of a VPP. For example, clause 13.1 requires now, developments to adapt to the impacts of climate change through risk-based planning, to identify risk areas, and to integrate land use planning with emergency management decision-making. Clause 19, that's specifically on energy developments, requires planners to ensure that energy generation, storage, transmission, and distribution infrastructure and projects are resilient to the impacts of climate change. So here we have a specific call out to the planner to make a resilience assessment when they are looking at a specific development. This is new, so we don't know yet how this will be applied and how, for example, resilience as a word, which is not defined in the Climate Change Act, will be interpreted by the planners. So this is basically a space to watch, but it is interesting that we are seeing these express references to resilience popping up. I also, just as a note, one of the things that a planner will have to look at, according to section 60, as I said earlier, is policy guidelines and so on. We have relevant guidelines for solar energy facilities, for wind energy facilities, we have Victoria's climate change strategy, which also needs to be taken into account. There is in the Victorian climate change strategy a more general commitment to future climate resilience of communities and the built environment. In the more specific guidelines, the solar and wind ones, the wind doesn't mention it, the solar mentions it, but again, we haven't seen what has been made of that. So at the moment, these are just words until someone applies them and interprets them, if you like. So do Victorian planners now have all the tools? We don't know yet. I've looked at planning panel reports. They talk quite a lot about the fact that the Climate Change Act requires resilience, but there haven't been any specific conditions and discussions attached to this. And something I want to reiterate is, especially for network investment, this is coming late. So, you know, we have the RIT-T on the RIT-D, so the basically the regulatory assessments at the electricity market stage happening. Investment needs to be identified before in the integrated system plan by AMO and so on. So we have a whole lot of steps before at the tail end for very specific project, we are looking at planning law. So this is very, resilience should probably come much earlier. And if you're looking back to Gregor's presentation, it needs to be done in a much more holistic way and in a step back way where we are asking, do we need this at all? Shouldn't we go decentralized? A really interesting development and something well worth following is Victoria's new Victorian Transmission Investment Framework. At the moment, you can find a preliminary design up there on the website. I've just checked, nothing new is in there yet. That would mean you have a pre-land use planning stage where you look at things like strategic land use planning assessment and multi-criteria analysis much, much earlier. So this transmission investment framework is directly linked to the declared renewable energy zones. And there's a, you know, basically a system scenario development analysis, which already at stage 2 develops pathways, which open, you know, the opportunity for a resilience assessment. And then later in stage 5, by the time you come to the relevant environmental and land use planning assessments and approval, there's an expectation that this earlier stage where you have a multi-criteria analysis, where you have a strategic land use planning assessment, you will be able to just, you know, refer back to it. So really an attempt of integrating the many different planning processes that are involved in getting a major piece of infrastructure on the road. So not enough detail yet about whether and how this could have a specific resilience assessment integrated, but definitely a space to watch. So that's it from me.
Oh, excellent. Thank you very much.
Yep. And yeah, I just have a couple of slides up here if you're interested in I've written on this earlier. Just want to point out the article I've done with Steph, that's already in 2017. We talk a little bit about whether or not law should define what resilience means and what resilience means in different disciplines. So there's other little side questions to consider. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing, I think.
Thanks very much, Anne. And I think you can see there this huge dilemma, really, with going forward towards 2050, but not necessarily having all of the structures and frameworks in place in terms of assessing how this infrastructure is going to be built, where it's going to be built. And of course, for us, the question is whether or not it is going to ultimately be resilient, because of all of the reasons that I mentioned earlier about why we need resilient electricity infrastructure. And So just to note that, in fact, Victoria is the most advanced in terms of trying to build resilience into their planning law frameworks. Queensland and New South Wales are not as advanced. And as Anne was saying, some of these developments only happened last year. So slowly but surely the regulators are catching up. So that's it. It's now time for questions. If anybody would like to ask a question, could they come to the microphone and just give their name and their organization? Yes.
Hi, Stefan Drück from Macquarie University. I have a question for Gregor. In background, it seems like huge investment is required to change our transmission grid to facilitate the transition. So you mentioned grid following and grid forming technologies. My question is, as an economist or someone who just looks at prices but not so much at the engineering of it, I mean, does our current system actually allow to form these microgrids or SAPs that you mentioned, or would huge investment be necessary for that? I'm asking this because it seems like if we have to transport electricity or build additional transition infrastructure, that would be very, very expensive. So maybe microgrids are the cheaper solution if they allow us to kind of offer independent or like basically going off grid. So, but my question is, how much would we have to invest, or is it even possible to do it with what we have at the moment?
Yeah. Thank you for the question. So, I did mention in my presentation that cost-wise, grid following and grid forming inverters are almost the same. It's just the control. The hardware is the same. It's just the control bit that is different. The problem is that currently there is no mandate for inverter manufacturers to have this grid forming capability for behind the meter devices. So what I'm saying is that if we mandate that, if we require inverter manufacturers to put that capability into the inverters, that won't cost much, or the marginal cost will be not very much. But this opens up an opportunity to do all kinds of stuff that I mentioned in my presentation. Now, I mean, I have to also acknowledge the fact that this is very early days. So 5 years ago, when you mentioned grid forming inverters, most people would have no idea what you're talking about, including people in the electricity business. So this is now rapidly emerging technology. AEMO is now doing a lot of trials using grid forming technology for utility scale batteries. So they see utility scale batteries, so large scale batteries like Hornsday Power is a big Tesla big battery, as a viable alternative to conventional synchronous machines to provide to provide system strength and inertia, which is the services that synchronous machines provided in the past. But nobody had yet seriously looked into using the same technology to provide the same services behind the meter, so at low voltage levels. So I guess this is still in the early days research-wise, but it is possible. So we show that we did simulations, so we show it's possible. It's just a question of mandating that technology. I mean, of course, there are other issues. So if you take, as I suggested in my presentation, if you want to take whole feeders offline, there's a problem of safety, many other issues that has to be dealt with. But this doesn't require costly technology. In fact, it's actually cheaper, because if you want to design a community to be a microgrid, you need to put in dedicated technology. So you have purposely built a community to be a microgrid. But if you use the existing technology to do the same purpose, then the equipment is already there. You just have to use it in a different way. So that's what I'm suggesting. I'm not saying it's easy, but what I'm saying is that it doesn't require a huge additional investment. Actually, the additional investment is very minor.
And I think that this really shows how these cascade events, so we have these massive events like the Black System in 2016, and then the question is, well, what do we do next? And so we get the batteries, and then we have floods and more fires and so on, and then engineers are always in the R&D phase to work out how we can do things differently. And so for us, it's trying also to understand what the engineers are doing, because, for example, when my colleague Rob Verchik was out from Loyola, and he's lived through Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Katrina, plus, and we sat down with Rob and we said, well, Rob, why aren't the grids sort of standalone? Why aren't we having microgrids, SAPs, and so on? And he had to explain to us this business about the grid, the forming of the reliability and so on. So it is very new, and that's why this project looking at climate-induced disasters and resilience is really a very multidisciplinary one, and we have to be able to know how to speak to each other and understand each other. So that was a great question. There may be people online who would want to ask a question, but first there's a question from the floor. Is there anyone online wanting to ask a question at this stage? No? Okay, great.
Thanks for this. Ariel Lieben, Monash Energy Institute. Thanks, Rosemary and Gregor. Can I ask questions from both of you?
Sure.
So I had, like on the resilience and the legal stuff, and Anne actually, sorry, I'm asking Anne as well. Hi, Anne. Maybe it seems to me that in terms of planning for climate resilience, there's sort of two horizons, roughly. There's the short term, which is like dealing with a, pretty bad, but relatively still not as bad as they'll get disasters. So that's maybe like now to 10 years away. But we're talking about really long-lived assets, transmission systems, which are, 50 to 80 years. And these things are the climate disasters or the extreme events they'll have to be resilient to will be more severe. So how do we think about that? Have you looked at, and maybe Gregor can comment on that as well, where do we go from that, particularly in the context of things like the Integrated System Plan and the RIT-T frameworks, which everything's sort of incremental, and I think Anne alluded to something that was effectively very incremental. You can only test on, this thing in this place. Where do we go from here? That's the question for you, and I'll probably, if there's time, I'll ask Gregor about his part.
Yeah.
So thanks.
I'll just jump in quickly in terms of the short term, because certainly, as you'll be aware, the first step which a utility will take is to desperately try to reconnect everybody to the existing grid, to the existing electricity infrastructure. And there may be thousands of kilometres of poles that have been knocked down. And so we saw, for example, in Victoria with the fires, the suggestion that there's no point in us building those poles. We're going to start investing in SAPs and so on. So I think in the short term, we're seeing very reactionary responses. And we're not seeing at the moment the kinds of long-term investments in resilience, as our research has shown. But definitely for the long term, this is what we're expecting to see, changes in the National Electricity Law objectives. But what we would also like to see, as Anne has said, is the changes in the planning framework. Because why is it that after all of that work has been done and the developer has invested, millions of dollars in the project that's going to go up in a res, and then at the very last stage, someone says, oh, hang on, you've actually got to get it passed by an authority. So, yeah, I think there are definitely this short term that we're still dealing with, but slowly there is this sort of consciousness coming through the AER, through the state governments, although the New South Wales res planning doesn't mention resilience at all. So we're at the very early stages, and we need to get better very fast. Yeah.
Can I jump in,
And please jump
Rosemary?
in, and Gregor as well.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Ariel. In the end, what we're doing right now is long-term planning, if you like, especially with the RES and connecting them. So network infrastructure is long-lived. So, we're looking at 30, 40 years for what we're building now. So I almost want to go one step back from your question and say, are we doing the right long-term planning right now? Because what we're doing is almost reactive long-term planning. We need to, build bigger and better. We are not really, we are opening these opportunities for individual communities to become independent, what Gregor talked about, but the big commitments of the states are large-scale investment, which may not be the cheapest. All of this was foreseeable for a while yet. In a way, I think we are doing this big investment, big planning, because this is this is most recognizable to what we already have. Here's the coal pit, next to is the power station, and then we connect that. And now we do that 6 times just with renewables across Victoria. So I reckon that train has left the station, we would say in Germany. We have this long-term big investment locked in, which makes it even more important to say, okay, if we are doing this, at least let's do it so it in 40 years' time it's not just a abandoned investment somewhere because we can't protect it, or it is actually actively dangerous, like the 2009 bushfires, a lot of which were caused by not sufficiently secured electricity infrastructure. So no good answers from the law here. What we can see though is that electricity market investment frameworks have not been particularly good at long-term planning. They are just doing this, fixing, making sure we deliver to everyone, and we haven't had the opportunity, or we haven't used the wording in the National Electricity Objective, which talks about the long-term interest of the consumer, to kind of step out and step higher beyond this, fixing short-term, fixing. So I don't have answers for you. It needs a lot of leadership, and I think this is something that comes through loud and clear in Rosemary's project.
Thanks. And Gregor, I'm sure you have something to add.
Well, I guess I leave it at that. So I'm an engineer, so I might underestimate when I say that we should be doing things differently. I guess the incumbents will have their own view. What I'm saying is that the technology already exists. We just have to use it smartly. So that's the smartening part of the story. So I'll just leave it at that.
And I think perhaps also thinking about the sort of economics of it all with regard to stranded assets. So what if we did allow all communities to just adopt Gregor's, technology, and it's all microgrids and that are off-grid and so on, and then what in terms of this massive infrastructure investment that we already have? So that's another question. Yes, the last question, because we only have 3 minutes left.
I better be quick. I think
Yes.
My question is to you, Professor Lister. I noticed in your presentation that your definition of resilience included cyber, which got me thinking. Because there has developed over the last, just very recently over the last few years, a legislative and regulatory regime regarding cyber protection obligations on owners and operators of critical infrastructure. And of course, energy easily explicitly falls within that regime. And I wonder if you've looked at whether a critical infrastructure all hazards view might be a more effective way of coming into this problem of how to create a resilience obligation within the energy sector.
Well, we actually did have a lot of hope when the critical infrastructure policy documents came out and the legislation and so on, that it would actually deal with that all hazards resilience kind of framework, but it doesn't actually. It, not for a long time. It's just been very much about cybersecurity in the sort of very traditional sense. And that's the Commonwealth situation, With regard to the critical infrastructure policies in New South Wales, it's very much a kind of neoliberal laissez-faire situation. We're not going to mandate anything. The owners and operators know what they need to do to protect their own assets, and they're going to do that. So we're just sort of setting out the policy guidelines. So it does depend which jurisdiction you're looking at, but the innovation in 2020 was this idea that under the Commonwealth critical infrastructure legislation, that utilities would have to prepare these material risks management plans. And when I last looked at it in about December last year, that was in draft form. But then again, what material risks is going to be required to be assessed under that? So, yeah. Critical infrastructure policy and legislation could have the potential for this holistic assessment, but at the moment it doesn't. So again, the law needs to be improved and updated to take account of what is happening. So that does bring us to the end of the session. Thank you very much for attending the session and for your questions, and thanks very much to Gregor always for having been on the project, and to Anne for having joined the project to have a look at this whole question of land use and planning. Thank you very much, everybody.